Right then, it's about time we got on with this Euro S50 single Vanos and rattle ring procedure then, innit? With a bit of help from Beisan, a lot of care and attention, and hopefully not too many squeaky bum moments. Let's get on with it then. So to give you a bit of background, I'm in the middle of doing a bunch of work to Natalie's M3. First thing that we did was we did some helicoils and the rocker cover bolts, and then we moved on to some shims. I'm kind of halfway through that process, and obviously because the engine is open at the moment, it's the right time to go ahead and do the Vanos procedure. For that reason, I'll be skipping the start of removing the coils and the rocker cover, the wiring loom and all that kind of gubbins. Hopefully that's fairly simple stuff. If you're involved in trying to do the Vanos procedure and you're following this as an instructional video, then you're going to know how to do that sort of stuff anyway. So let me show you where we're at with the car, what point we're kind of down to, and then we'll start sort of following the process, the Beisan Systems guidelines, and we'll get into this Vanos repair. Okay guys, so first part of the process is to get everything set up here so that it's ready to remove the Vanos, and the first part of that process is to rotate the engine until we're at top dead centre. We do that by going clockwise. I have a 36mm socket down here on the crank pulley, and I'm just going to keep turning until all the lines mark up. Now I reckon that we're actually there because we've got intake and exhaust pointing at 45 degrees to one another, but I have to check that using the timing mark that's down here at the bottom of the engine. They could have made it easier on the S50. It's buried right down underneath the water pump pipe. What I've got here is I'm right down just above the crank sensor, and I'm just adjusting it slightly so it's exactly in line with a little mark in the crankcase. And we'll get him lined up as best we can. Doesn't have to be exact from what I've read in the Beisan indicator, but there we go. So that looks like that's in time there. You can see that's confirmed also by the cams here. Okay, so I'm pretty happy. Engine is at top dead centre. Let's move forwards. Okay, so now we've got it in time. The next part of the process is just to check that the location pins are correct on the intake and the exhaust camshaft. There's some grooves cut in the back of the camshaft and in the front of the cam cap here. One of the cams will line up, that's the exhaust one. The intake cam is going to be a little bit retarded at the moment, I believe it is, and we'll be coming to advancing that later, but there'll be more on that in a few moments. You can also see here the two locating dowel holes, which should point directly upwards for the car to be completely in time perfectly. At this point, we then want to move forwards and take off the covers, the oil pit, pressure relief valve, and then we can start taking the solenoids out. So we begin that process by taking off a couple of these little nuts for this plastic cover here, and then we can just pull him forwards, chuck the nuts back in there and discard him for now. And then underneath there we've got a couple of cable connectors. Push up an old connector, pull the wire back, and it actually tells you in the guide to remove the cable from the actual clip itself. Now we have a secondary one underneath. Okay, so that's two. As you can see, we've had quite an oil leak in this engine. This is partly why we're doing this. This wire here and this connector here, which are right underneath the Vanos solenoid body, are for the top solenoid. This wire here and the one that clips in here is for the bottom solenoid. Being the early model here with the single Vanos, they exit top and bottom rather than both out the bottom. They're actually numbered. So this one is classed as solenoid number 1, that's the bottom one, and the top one is classed as number 2. The other thing I'm going to unplug whilst I'm here is going to be the Vanos bridge sensor. That then allows all these wires to come free. I think we are free now to move upwards and get on with doing the Vanos oil feed. And this is where oil starts leaking out, I believe, so that should help us stop any oil spillages. I want to undo this nut here and this 22mm nut there. Okay, so oil pip first. I'm using a flare nut spanner here. You want to use an open-ended box wrench, but if you've got flare nut spanners, use them. This guy can now be lifted up and out of the way, I believe. It tells you in the instructions just to loosen this nut off, purely because it's easier to undo it on the car than it is on the bench. The next part of the process is to remove the solenoid cover and take the solenoids out. This is where you start getting a little bit concerned, because I've read many times that a lot of these little tiny bolts are no good. You're going to notice I've got another one in here. I'll come back to that in a moment. That's one that I've replaced briefly just to make sure it fits. I'm going to be changing all of these bolts for a slightly different type of bolt, a little bit tighter, a little bit better bolt. Grab a tool and we'll start taking this solenoid cover off now. Okay, so all these cap head bolts are a 4mm Allen socket, so I'm just going to be extremely careful. Just gently crack these. See the sealant on there. I've actually been in here before and I've resealed this Vanos solenoid cover, and somebody had been in here before me, because none of these bolts have got any yellow paint marks on, I don't believe. And in the Beisan thing it tells you should see that if it's never been opened before, you know, factory torque marks basically. So cover can come off now, right? And surprisingly it's not full of oil. It has two seals. There's one paper gasket here and one here. I'm going to be making my own ones of them in a moment when I come to put this all back together, but at this point now I can begin to remove the wiring for the solenoids and pull the solenoids out. So, right, so the top solenoid wiring is loose, the bottom is loose. I believe now what I have to do is get in there and pry out the solenoid with a flathead screwdriver. Reasonably loose, there we are, that's nice and easy to come out, okay. And we get a little drip of oil, so that's the bottom one out as well. What it tells you now to do is grab a bit of tissue and stuff it in that hole. Okay, so if we were just doing the solenoids, we're now at the point where we can go and take them to the bench, get the seals off them and start having a look at cleaning them. I'm not just doing that, obviously, I'm going to do the whole thing here. So I'm going to pull the solenoids over to the bench and then consult the Bible of Beisan to see where we go next. Okay, so the next thing to do is to move this intake camshaft into the retarded position, and that's done to basically push the piston forwards to allow us to undo the nut that's on the end of the piston behind this cover. It's done by putting a 24mm box wrench on that marker there, on that hex, sorry, and I have to just wobble this backwards and forwards, I believe, until we can get the lines marked up. So, right, and they're now lined up, so I'm just going to photograph that so you can see what I've got in front of me there. So now, hopefully if you've got that picture, you can see that those lines are marked up. Excellent. So now we have to remove the Vanos cover itself, and that's done by same bolts as before, 4mm Allen heads, and then I'll pry this cover off. Now this cover's got one of the O-rings in it. It will be a little bit resistant to coming away, I believe. It tells you to use a putty knife on the Beisan instructions. I don't think I've got a putty knife, but I've got a blade that I can use, so we'll get that in there. Okay, out she comes. And another little spillage of oil, that's okay. So we'll take this cover and stick him on the bench. Okay, so that was a bit of a mess. So just to explain, this little intake spline shaft here is supposed to have a 4mm hex head. Someone had been in here before and knackered it with a pair of pliers. I tried to force a Torx head on there, but as you tap it, it just starts forcing the piston in and in and in. I eventually had to resort to using a pair of pliers myself and just undoing the nut. Now I'm at the point where I can only just grab it with the pliers. I'm still undoing the nut, and I'm hoping I can get it to the point here fairly quickly where I can just wind the nut off by hand, which I've managed to do. There we go. And the next thing I've got to do is I've got to remove the Vanos bridge sensor here. So that comes off with the two plates, and I think they're a slightly bigger Allen bit. So they're a HW5. Okay, number one. Number two. Now this will have an O-ring holding it in, so I expect this will be a little bit tight. There we go, away he comes. O-ring looks fairly reasonable on him, but we'll go and keep him safe. Again, pop him on the bench. The next point of the job here is to start taking off all these Vanos bolts, the bridge, and then I can start to remove the Vanos from the head. Before I get into that, I bought this set of longer Allen key bolt heads, or bolts, longer Allen keys, whatever they want to be called. And what I've done, they're actually a bit too long to get right in there. As you can see, I have no clearance behind it to work the tool. So I've just taken the 5mm one and I've cut him down so I can get in there and I can undo these nice and easily. I'll crack these two, I'm going to get on and crack the rest of them now and then start removing this from the head. So we've got obviously the two from the bridge, which come off straight away. The two here, we've got one right down the centre here, which is the one that holds the ground wire as well. One below the piston here itself, one up in this top face. Yep, there's one right between the solenoids and the oil pump cover. And I've got a feeling there's one more down here. Yeah, right underneath the oil pump. You can tell where they are because the Vanos itself has got a cut out next to the solenoid, next to the oil pump cover. I'll show you that when we get it on the bench. So I can now wind these out completely. That's the three from the top, and then we'll go down from the bottom from right to left. So this one here, like I said, right below the piston is the one that's got the earth wire on it. Pull that earth wire down and out the way. Tells you in the manual just to hook it underneath the cable connector there, just to get it out of the way of the Vanos unit. Apparently it's quite easy to get it stuck between the Vanos unit and the head when you put the Vanos unit back on. Next thing I've got to do is get in the top and remove the Vanos bridge itself. And that's not the same size Allen head. I think it's slightly bigger. So we got to a 6, I think, for this one. And on the Euro, as you may have read, the two bolts in the middle are the same length as the two on the outsides. They are all full of oil. What I want to do is make sure I get a really good contact in there before I start putting any torque on them. So just to confirm, there's the 4 bridge bolts, 2 outside and 2 middle ones, all exactly the same size, not as the Beisan Systems one says that they are different sizes. Okay, so now we can pull the bridge off. Now it says to wiggle this backwards and forwards to release the seal. There we go, it's one side. And there is the bridge with no sealant on the bottom of it. Interesting. So that needs fixing when we put it back together. Now I can begin to pry the Vanos away from the car. Now the most important bit of this process is to not drop the oil pump driver, because if I do, I have to take the sump off. So I'm just going to photograph that for you guys so you can see what I'm talking about with this driver. I believe now I can just pull the Vanos back and away from the head. Now there's a little O-ring on the end of the piston here, which I have to get it past. What I would like to do if I can is pull this driver off so I can stop being paranoid about it. That's what it looks like, guys. I'm going to pop him down out of the way. Right, so basically it just tells you to wiggle the Vanos upwards and downwards and pull it off of this piston here. There we go. Oh. So there we have one Vanos unit. Excellent. Let's get this over on the bench and start cleaning it up. So there she is. There she is. First things first, let's give this a bit of a clean before we go any further at all. Okay then, boys and girls, here we go. So I thought it was about time we talked about what we've purchased here. So up the top we've got the 3 different kits from Beisan. The first one is the seals repair kit, which I'm sure you'll have seen before. That gives us most of the Vanos seals. The second one is the rattle ring, which has got 2 washers and a ring inside. The third one is the Vanos tools. Now these are quite important because to do the rattle ring procedure you need this little block that goes in your vise so you can hold the actual pinion, and this special socket here. And then we've got here from Hack Engineering. This all come from Hack, so thank you for them for importing this stuff. This is the Vanos filter O-ring, not O-ring, sorry, sealing ring. I'm not actually going to be doing that right now because we don't have another one of them and I want to wait until BMW opens back up before I can get one. It's easy enough to change once it's back in the car, so it's not too much of a problem. And likewise, we've bought a couple of uprated seals here for the solenoids. Now I also have solenoid filters coming. I will admit that I went and bought these from eBay. These are just uprated Viton rubber, not the, I think it's the M5 seals with a special profile. I will actually put these in the car for a short time and then later on down the road I'm going to get the M5 ones once BMW opens up. Kind of what we're going to be changing right now is we're going to be doing all the stuff at the top there minus this little filter which is going in this housing here. And also whilst we're there I'm going to change some of these bolts like I've mentioned to you. So these little bolts are the ones that go in the covers here. They are M5x1, so they're very, very thin, and from what I've read they're prone to shearing. So I've decided to not go with these and to not go with an uprated one from BMW. I think these are grade 8.8. Yeah, they're 8.8 grade. What I've actually done is I went and I got myself a bag of exactly the same thread, pitch and length bolts from a fastener supplier, which are also M5x1, but these are grade 12.9. They've got a slightly smaller head. It's exactly the same Allen head size, nothing different there. The bolt is basically identical bar the washer here. So I'm going to nip down to Screwfix this afternoon, which is a hardware supplier here in the UK if you're watching in America. I'm going to grab myself some washers so we can put all new bolts in all these covers on that side, this side, and hopefully in here as well. So we won't have any problem with them in the future. Where do we go from here? We have to just follow the old procedures, I guess. So I'm just going to get myself set up ready to start this process and then we'll get cracking. So let's tidy up some of this rubbish here. Okay, so first part of the game is to pull the piston out. Now it tells you to turn this over and push the piston out with your finger. This piston is actually so loose. It's just dropping out on me. So this is the intake piston itself. He goes to the side to begin with. And then what I have to do here is turn this over and undo all these cover bolts here. Pull off the cover. Then we have the cover comes off. So this one, he's got an O-ring around the outside and he's got a seal in the middle there. And then I believe I have to just pull a washer out here with my fingers and then I have to drive this piston out towards the front. Don't need the socket. There we are. Okay, so the first thing it tells you to do is to replace this O-ring here. Yeah, you can see there basically the same O-ring. Oh, there we go. So that's like a regular rotational seal, like a shaft seal basically that you'd find similar to what you find in a rear main seal or a gearbox seal, something like that. Okay, so I want to just give all these parts a wash. Okay, so now we've got to that point, I've got those parts clean. So in this packet here, we should have 2 seals that are identical. I'm going to use a tiny bit of assembly lubricant on these, just to aid them going in. Just the tiniest of bits on my fingers. And then we'll just drive this down into this hole. What I think I'll do, use that old one. Let's give a little tap. I want to make sure he goes flush, I believe, but I'm going to come back and I'll check that in a second. So, okay, so it tells me to take the piston and insert it into the Vanos unit from the outside, make sure it's lubricated. So just so you get an idea what was happening there, it says to lubricate cylinder Vanos housing to ease cylinder installation, insert intake cylinder into Vanos housing from the Vanos outboard side. Rotate cylinder in Vanos to align the cylinder cutouts with the Vanos cylinder. Turn it inboard side down to keep the cylinder in the housing. Okay, so now it tells me to grab the cover and pull the old oil ring off. Give another little wash. So what it then tells you to do is basically use this cover bare to press the piston in from the other side to the correct depth. So that's going to involve just popping this back on for a second and tightening up the bolts correctly. And this is obviously before you put the O-ring in. If you put the O-ring in, it's just going to seal itself in here and you don't want that. Okay, so that's all 5 done up. This should then be at the correct depth. So I believe I can just remove this now. So the next process is to put the new O-ring on this cover, bit of lube. And then the process on the Beisan thing calls me to do the seal here, which we've already done. So let's just skip forwards then a slight bit. So this consists of a couple of parts. There's an O-ring and there's a sort of seal on the outside. This should press the whole way in, and it says just to use your thumbs, which I've now done. Hopefully you can make out that that's just sitting below the chamfer line there, and this should essentially be able to allow the piston to run inside of it, which is nice and tight. Lovely. Okay, right, so the next part of the process is to deal with that piston. So this just comes apart by hand, and then I should be able to just pry this off. Yep. So we have the outer ring there, and then we have this inner seal. And interestingly, there's a bit of paper gasket which has just come away there. Oh, I've dropped it, bugger. It doesn't matter, we don't need that. It's actually sitting on here. So this is essentially the main seal. So this time I'm not going to clean that up too much. I want there to be a little bit of lube on there. So the only seal that we've got now is this one here. So we're going to take the rubber ring, pop him on here. And then this lovely Teflon ring here should slip over the top of it, but it won't want to go easily. So this is where we've got to do the old stretcher-inny. It does warn you to only go as far as you need to. Okay guys, so we're still stretching here, taking our time. I'm a bit paranoid about going too far, if I'm honest. So I'd rather take ages to do it and get it close than bugger it up by going a bit too far. Oh, there we go. Beautiful. So the next thing to do is just pop it back together again, like so, and drive it down into the piston. So it says again a bit of assembly lube in there. There's a chamfer, I believe, yet on the end here. It's easier said than done, this part. Right, it's in. Okay, right, so it tells you to fully insert it and leave it for a minute. So I'm going to do that and take a break. Okay, so that's been in there a couple of minutes now. I can now push that out. And it tells you just to visually verify that it's gone in the right way. And it's reduced its size, which it looks like it has beautifully. And then it tells you to pop it in this way around using the piston end cap. Okay, so we succeeded, we've got the cap in there. It now tells me to take the piston and turn it sort of head side up, so it's standing vertically, and place the washer down over it. And then it tells me to take the cover, which is lubricated already, and press it down on top of here. And then clean up the bolts. So this is then going to insert like so. We don't actually have any dowels on this one. See, it feels like it's binding to me. I'm not happy with that. Okay, now I just have to get that lined up so that I can bolt it up. Now at this point I'm going to pause because I want to go and get some more bolts before I go any further. So I'm going to be tightening the bolts up next. Right, scratch that. What I'm going to do is do this cover, the O-ring underneath that cover, and the O-rings on this side as well. I will just pop in a couple of these older bolts just to make sure it doesn't fall out on me. Right, I will admit that was quite anxiety inducing. We've managed to finally get all the cover bolts out. These are covered in thread lock, and I now think that it's absolutely nothing to do with the actual bolts that get stuck. It's just the fact they use so much thread lock, they seize up, and if you're not extremely careful, and they'll get stuck in there. I have managed to sort of tighten them and loosen them and tighten them and loosen them until I got to the point where they felt like I could get a bit of thread, a bit of penetrating oil in there, which I did. And once that went in, it started to loosen up quite well. So all I can suggest is if you're doing this, just really take your time with them. They will come out, but they take a lot of care just to make sure that you don't snap them off. So this cover again has got a little O-ring. I'm just prying around the edges, try and get in there and get them up. go. Right, so we have a loose washer here. Got a nice thin O-ring on this side. A smaller one down here. So that thin O-ring is one of the last 3 large ones that we've got. Slip him on there. And this O-ring in here. We now have a few smaller ones left. 3 that look the same. I believe they're all identical, but I'm not entirely sure. No, they're not. This one is actually thinner than the other 2. One's going to go on that side. One of them is going to come around here and go on this side. We'll do him whilst we're here. Whilst I'm here, I'm also going to pop off this larger, thicker one here. And then finally on this main body, one more O-ring here. That just leaves me with those 3 left in there, which I believe are for this part. So the next part is the pressure restrictor. I'm expecting this to leak. So we have this smaller one that's supposedly going to fit in that groove in there. Larger one for the top. Now this smaller O-ring here, I believe I have to cut him off. Pull the larger one off to begin with. And it makes quite a point of saying you've got to be extremely careful. There's actually a plastic O-ring just at the tip of that spike there, and then this sort of plastic washer and then the O-ring. Okay, so that's done. That just gets screwed back on. And it says just to do it by hand. We'll tighten it finally once it's back in the car. So that one last little O-ring is the O-ring which is going to go in the end of the rattle ring. Next part we've got to do are the solenoids. So I'm just going to pause it here and I'll get all this cleaned up and get the solenoids in place. Okay, so we'll pause the old solenoids for a second. We'll come back to doing this cover. So I've been out to Screwfix like a good boy should, and I got myself a pack of washers. These are just M5 by 10mm washers, and we'll start screwing in some of these new bolts. As I said, I got grade 12.9 bolts here, and I'm going to use a bit of thread lock on them just to be sure, because they only get done up to, according to Beisan, 6 Newton meters, and I don't even think I've got a torque wrench that can deal with that with this socket that I've got here. So okay, so apparently my torque wrench goes 5 to 80 foot-pounds, and it's supposed to be 4.5 foot-pounds. I don't know how much I'll trust the torque wrench at that lowest setting, but if we've got it we should try and use it. Right, there's only 5 of these. It looks like you need 6, but the one at the bottom is actually just a hole. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to be winding it in by hand to draw the cap down onto the surface. Okay, let's try this. 5 Newton meters malarkey. 5 foot-pounds, sorry. Excellent, that worked. There's 5 cover bolts in, and then we'll do the same with this side. Okay, I'm happy with all of them. I'm just going to go back to these ones just to double check that the torque is the same. So that's the covers on both sides with new bolts. Let's continue with the solenoids. Okay, so back to these. So this is number 1 solenoid, number 2, or number 1 and number 2. They start off looking a bit like this, covered in oil with the filter gauze and the 2 O-rings. I've removed the filter gauze from this one. I've actually ordered 2 of these, but they've not arrived yet. These are made of some kind of nylon and they just disintegrate. If I just get in there, you'll be able to see it should just be falling apart in my hands. They're probably doing more harm than good, clogging up the actual solenoid itself. So that bit there and the corresponding bit on this side is going to go in the bin. I'll just pull that off by levering it up here. It's clogged in this corner. It's full of gunk around it. In general, it has a hole here also, so they're definitely no good. Now I do know that the contacts here are susceptible to going cold or going dry, so I might have a little look at seeing if I can just reflow them whilst I'm here. Right, and then popping the O-rings out is as simple as just getting in there with whatever pick tool you choose. These are the old O-rings. They have gone very hard and very square in profile. You won't be able to see it on camera, but looking at this eye on, it's not an O-ring anymore, it's more like a square cut O-ring. So they're going to be replaced for the ones that we bought separately. Okay, so I found a little 9-volt transformer. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take the solenoid. Red side is going to be positive, green side, or green and blue here, is going to be negative, and I'm just going to actuate straight onto the circuit board, but I'm just going to spray a bit of brake cleaner on there first. Getting quite a good click out of that. Seems fairly good to me. Both of them are clicking quite nicely. A couple more O-rings. Okay, so they're done apart from that little filter. So let's pop them off to the side. Okay, so we're a day later, hence the trimmed beard, the new shirt. Just got up this morning. We finished last night by doing the solenoid O-rings, didn't we? Let's just recap what we've done, and I'm going to move on after this to start the rattle ring procedure. So we've got our fully rebuilt, pretty much Vanos unit, all new bolts in the oil housing cap, or the oil pump cap, all new bolts in the piston cap here, a new O-ring here, a new O-ring here, a new O-ring here, and then a new O-ring behind this cap, all new Vanos O-rings and setups. We've got the new O-rings on the two solenoids, and we've given the wiring a little bit of a clean up. We've got a new O-ring on the piston cap itself. We've put new O-rings on the oil pressure valve, and then just what I've done this morning is I've cut myself a couple of new gaskets out of some gasket paper, some Flexoid gasket paper, tried to match the size as best I could to the one that came off the car, and I'll be using just a skim of sealant to hold them on this cover for the Vanos solenoids before I pop that on the car. So we're now at the point where I'm waiting on the Vanos solenoid filters before I can put them back in, but they go back in once the Vanos is back on the car anyway. I think it's probably prudent now to move on and do the rattle ring procedure, get that out, get it on the bench and get all that sorted so that I can put that back in the car, can start cleaning things, and then I can start reassembling the Vanos. Okay, so first part of the rattle ring procedure is to pull the intake spline shaft and the actual gear out of the intake camshaft itself, and to do that I need to make sure the car's at top dead centre. I've obviously already done that to remove the Vanos. Okay, so once she's at top dead centre, next thing you've got to do is verify that the notches line up at the back here on the cam gear, and it tells you just to adjust it as necessary using a 24mm wrench, which is now bang on, and that should protrude the gear from the end of the cam, which it does. What we now need to do is turn the camshaft, I believe, to pop it out. So I've got to rotate camshaft counterclockwise until the intake spline shaft helical gears fully exit the spline shaft, and it tells you that once you've done that, the intake camshaft cylinder 1 cams will point horizontally. So let's just bring it over. So that's just exited there, I believe. And that again, yep, looks just like the Beisan picture. I'm happy with that. I would say that that cam is sitting fairly horizontal. Now what I'm going to do is mark it up as it says in the instruction manual here. So obviously need to clean that with something. Right, so we're giving it a clean with brake clean. I'm going to mark right next to the bolt hole here, I think, and I'm going to mark this spline shaft here. It now says you can just pull this out, and it's not wrong. There we go. So here we have the actual piston itself, or the gear itself. So we've got a couple of things to do. We've got to take all this apart, we've got to try and fix this end some way, and we've got to clean it all up and put it back together. Bench time, I think. First things first, let's check this. So it spins very freely, but I will be honest and say that in out I can feel very little play. I can feel a little bit of a rocking, but it's difficult to determine how much of that is really radial play, which is like this I believe, or axial. If I put my finger on the top of it, you can see there's a little bit of rolling around there. Evidently we've got it apart, we've got all the tools, so we're going to be sorting this out anyway. So first thing we've got is this Beisan toolkit. This is the holder which this drive has to go in, and that slots in there quite nicely actually. I was expecting it to be a bit tight there, it's not. We need a good old bench vise for this. First thing I need to do is make sure that that's in there nice and tight, which it is, and then we can drop our little gubbins down inside of there. Now we then need this special socket with these two little protrusions to go all the way down over the top of this and to engage properly with the cap here. This is where an impact wrench is going to come in handy, because I've got to hold this down and try and buzz this off. It tells you to use the lowest setting, so let's just see. Let's see what happens if we try that first of all. Here we go. Okay, I'll do the rest of it by hand, I think. Yes, always have your vise obviously attached to your workbench. In this new place where I'm at, I don't have a workbench yet, so I'm making do. This is just a cap that screws off, and beneath it is a stack of bearings basically, and a little ring. What we're trying to attempt to do is to fill the loose gap that's between this cap and the bottom of the spline sort of cup part with a slightly thicker part from Beisan. Okay, so first part we have taken out. Oh, it's actually lifted a bunch of stuff out with it there. I wasn't expecting that. Okay, the cap. Let's get rid of that O-ring, I think. So we have the cap that comes off, and then the first washer, and then the first needle bearing. And then we actually have the spline shaft itself, which goes into another needle bearing with another washer. Okay, so there's our other washer. And then we've got the little ring. This is the bad boy we're going to be changing along with the washers. And then all that's left behind is the actual cup that it all sits within. Okay, so this is what's left behind. It's just an empty cup basically, with nothing left in it. I'll actually leave that there. We'll have a little look at these parts. So this is the main outer ring, which feels quite sharp at the edges, surprisingly. We have the first washer, which is going to be changed. The needle bearing itself, which will remain. Another needle bearing, the shaft, and then the cap, and another washer. So if we pop the washers and the ring to the side, now these are essentially reversible. There's no reason why you can't flip them over. The cap obviously only goes one way, and then the spline shaft is the important part. So in this kit here, we should have a pair of washers and one lovely Beisan ring. So these two washers are reversible, they're just stamped steel washers, and then this ring should have on the outside of it a BS mark that's been laser engraved in there. So this is slightly taller, I believe, if this is like my M52 one, than the original one would be, so that it takes up the slack within here. Onwards and upwards with the old rattle finish here. So the first thing we've got to do is clean out any thread lock that remains in these holes in here. We've cleaned all the oil off all the other parts. So first thing it tells you to do, I believe, is to put the ring in, and you've got to make sure that goes all the way down, rotate it 90 degrees, make sure it's still in there. Lovely. Second part is washer number one, that just drops straight into the bottom. Third part is going to be the actual thrust bearing itself. I'm going to use a assembly lube here just to make sure it's oiled up properly. Third part then is going to be the shaft itself. A little bit more lube and another bearing and then another washer. That's got to be made sure that that is sitting absolutely perfectly. And then you can see if it had no cap on it, this would be axial play in and out or rocking like so. So what this cap now does is it compresses this whole stack so that it all sits nice and flush. So we'll pop the cap back on without any thread lock to begin with. And I'm doing that just to make sure it's all sitting flush. I'm not liking the way that that's tightening in there, so I'm just going to pull it apart and make sure that everything is seated correctly, which it looks like it is. I think what I might do is stick this washer into the cap. I'm a bit paranoid that this washer is going to not sit in its locator inside the cap like so. So I'm going to use a little bit of lube, I think, on that to make sure that stays where it's supposed to, which looks like it's doing already. Okay, that's sitting nice and flush. So 40.5 foot-pounds or 55 newton meters. Bear me 1 second, folks. A little bit of improv needed here. Okay, so that's now tight. There's a little bit of resistance there, but not too much. There's basically no axial play. There's a tiny bit of radial play. So yet again, Beisan has hit the ticket there, and I don't have to do any adjustment. That feels pretty nice to me. There's no binding, so it's got a little bit of motion. It's not as easy to move as it was before. Right, let's tear it apart, put some thread lock on there, and then get it back together. So there we have it, one rebuilt S50 Vanos. The only thing it just needs now is an O-ring. Right, so let's reinstall the bugger. Back over to the car then, I guess. I hate using this term, but the reinstallation is the reverse of removal in this case. Two things I want to just mention. It obviously says quite clearly that you've got to note that you don't turn the camshaft too far either way when you remove it, and likewise when you turn it back, you've not got to turn it too far, so you can check that your timing is correct. Just in case I end up making a cock up here, what I'm doing right now is I'm just going to make a little mark on the back of the camshaft here, or the cam bearing, and I'm going to take a photograph of that so I know exactly what orientation it was at before I restart this process. The reason being is that it tells you to look for the orientation of the camshafts being horizontal. I could actually use this cam lobe being upwards. I just want to be absolutely sure I get this back in exactly the right place. So if I do need to go back and retrace my steps, I can get everything back in alignment like it was when I started. So all you've got to do is pop the spline shaft back in, and what I've also done here is I've remarked the two marks that I had before, so you may or may not be able to see them here, but there they go, they join up absolutely perfectly. And I've got to hold this in and rotate the camshaft. So I've got to come around this side of the engine, and we'll just start going backwards from whence we began. There we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to check is where is the mark in the back of the cam, and it tells you to double check that they're lined up as they were before. So that is now lined up perfectly with the little notch in the back of the cam cap. I'll just leave him there for a second. I must admit that's easier than the M52 one by a long way. So I'm now happy. I've got to do a lot of cleaning up here now and get rid of a bunch of this oil and this sludge that's down here inside the bottom of the engine. I believe a lot of that was possibly leaking out the O-ring, which sits just in this part of the journal here. Do the same thing underneath here. Clean out all the cabling that you can see here that's absolutely filthy. Good bit of brake cleaner there, I reckon. And then I can start thinking about putting this Vanos back on. Okay, so the first part of the process that Beisan tells you to do is to adjust the camshaft, the intake camshaft slightly to turn it clockwise. So the first part of the process that Beisan tells you to do is to advance the intake camshaft slightly so that the alignment marks are slightly pushed clockwise. So it doesn't show it by much, just a tiny little bit like so. I think I'll go just a smidge more. I'm fairly happy with that. And then we've got to grab the Vanos unit and start to basically slide it back on. So I'm just checking to make sure I've got enough oil on the O-rings, which I think I do. All we have to do is basically make sure the wiring is out of the way. You can see I've tidied up all the wiring down here. Insert it onto the Vanos spline shaft, and it says it's going to bind slightly, so you've got to wiggle it. Get this in close enough. I can then get the oil pump driver onto the exhaust cam. Okay, I think that needs rotating ever so slightly. So I'm just going to draw it back a touch. Oh, okay. There we go, and a nice clunk there. Confident that that driver has now engaged. So the next part of the process is the Vanos bridge. Got our 4 bolts and our bridge. Bolts are done up to 10 Newton meters, but the bridge needs a bit of sealant on it first. I'm going to copy exactly what Beisan have done. I'm just using some Worth sealant here. Same stuff you always see me use, guys. And I just want a tiny smear on the faces that contact the head. Now, this is fairly critical in these engines because this bridge here creates the opening, essentially, that the 2 parts of the piston and the oil driver go into. So fairly happy with that. Let's leave that for a moment. Okay, so if you remember from before, these are a H6. I think it's a 6mm Allen head socket. That's had a couple of minutes to set. It's fairly easy how this goes on. It's not too complicated. Now in the Beisan instructions it says that the large oil pump driver has to be on the left. It's different on the Euro S50. The S52 is the one that the Beisan is based on, I think. Basically the cast part faces backwards, and if you have a little look at the sensor body here, it's sort of got a counter bore to accept the O-ring in it. So this part goes forwards. I'm just going to lay it down gently on the studs, and once it's there I'm just going to give it a little push down, make sure it's mated. Lovely. Let's drive the bolts in. So I'm actually going to tighten the 2 inboard ones first. 7 foot-pounds, 10 Newton meters or 7 foot-pounds. Okay, and then we can plug the Vanos in. This then should just slot forwards into the head. Okay, so it's a process here of winding this on as straight as you can and being very, very careful you don't get any binding on this side. If you do, then it means that the oil pump driver is not engaged with the camshaft properly. Unlike the M52, there's no gasket that seals this to the front of the head. The oil control is all taken up by the O-rings that are around the 2 sort of piston in the oil pump driver that you've seen earlier. That's gone on like silk. Okay, torque specs on these are a little bit less, I think they're 8 Newton meters. 8 Newton meters or 6 foot-pounds. And then I believe the next thing to do is to install the top dead centre sensor. They're 8 Newton meters also. Okay, so first Beisan failure there. This plate here and the sensor has to go in before these top 2 bolts have to go in. There's actually no bolt that holds this sensor in. I've just realised it's just got a blank hole there. It's held in completely by this little plate here. This little plate then will sit like so. So the plate's got a little tang in it to make sure that the sensor doesn't rotate in its housing. I'm not going to plug them in yet because I've got to have a solenoid plugged in along with that wire. It might be easier whilst I've got this loose to just rotate things. We can now plumb back in the Vanos pipework. Okay, this pipe is a fucking nightmare. Because it's a steel pipe and not copper, getting it at just the right angle is next to impossible. Any of you that have done brake lines will know how critical it is that you get these threads absolutely straight. Okay, I think we're rocking. There are 2 more bolts underneath here where my fingers go in. So the Vanos itself has 7 bolts. The top dead centre sense has its own too, so you can call it 9 in total. Right, next part of the process is the bit I'm most afraid by, which is attempting to get this little nut on this tiny little spline with its completely knackered end, guys. Obviously, this is not the way you're going to be doing this if you've got a nicely prepared S50 Vanos that's not been mullered by the person previous to you. I'm not going to be able to torque this. I'm going to have to do it by feel. The torque on this is tiny, so we're tightening to 9 Newton meters on this as well, 6.5 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to make sure that's in, which I'm happy with. It's immediately beginning to turn there. I now have to use a pair of pliers, hold this pinion. I think we're probably tight enough to be fair, but next part is put the cover on, which I'm going to be using my new bolts for. Now this cover actually only goes on one way. There's an indent, it's quite hard to make out just here. The BMW logo basically faces upwards. That indent clears this oil housing here. Cover goes on, and then same thing again I think here. Oh no, that pops on alright, that, nice one. As you stand here and you take your time, you realise that you've made another mistake, and I've forgotten the Vanos ground wire, which is this bad boy here. He needs to go in the bolt just above him. This is Sunday morning, maybe I shouldn't have bothered this morning, eh? At least we've remembered before we finish the job. There we are, lovely, all 6 of them. And I think we've got one final thing to do before we can start talking about putting solenoids back in, which is the oil feed hose itself, or the oil pressure regulator, sorry. This little bad boy here feels pretty good to me. We'll be checking that for leaks when we get it all back together. Okay, Vanos is on. As you know, I'm waiting for seals to arrive, or filters to arrive for the 2 solenoids. We're still waiting on shims for one of the exhaust valves, or sort of both the exhaust valves on cylinder 1. So I'm kind of at a point now where I can't really go much further. It's not as bad as it looks. Let's pause it here. We'll come back when we've got our filters. And boom, as if by magic, a couple of little brand new solenoid filters. So I believe this is just a case of pushing them down onto the solenoids. But I'd like to make sure there's one hole where the oil goes into the solenoid, and I want to make sure that that is sitting sort of in the centre. There we go, that's easy peasy. Just push them down by hand. So the hole is just behind the gauze there. Wunderbar. Right, let's pop over to the car, we'll get these installed. Before we do, what I will do here is I'm just going to put a tiny smear of RTV on this face just to adhere the gaskets to. I'm just going to go and grab that. Right then, let's go and pop these solenoids on. Okay guys, so we've got the 2 solenoids, we've got the cover, 4 bolts, 4 new bolts with new washers. These are going to be tightened up to 8 Newton meters or 6 pound-feet of torque, and a little bit more sealant. What I'm going to do first and foremost is squeeze a tiny dab of sealant on the actual Vanos body where the sealant is going to go, where the seal is going to go. It tells you in the Beisan article just to put a few dabs. It's really just to help locate the seal. Lovely. And then I believe the top one is the one with the longer cable that follows itself around here, so I'm just going to push him in, but I'm going to do the bottom one first, so I've got a bit of clearance down there, and I've got to line the cable grommets. So just going to sit the solenoid in to begin with, get the grommet in place, and then I'm going to push him in. Lovely little snap, that's quite nice. Same with the top one, get the grommet in place, come on, push in. Lovely. I think what I'll do is I will put the cover on to begin with, and that will make sure that the grommets don't move. So what did we say, we did 8 Newton meters or 6 pound-feet. Okay, let's do the cables. So that's the top one. These are keyed, so they can only go in one way. So that's all our plugs done back up. Cables are reattached together. Everything is cleaned up under here. Everything is nice and tight. There's only one more bit to put on with regards to the Vanos. That's a little cable tidy. Got a little black cap head nuts. So we need to put the valve cover gasket back on, the 2 shims in valves 1 and 2 on the exhaust side, stick the valve cover back on, radiator and fan, plug everything back in, and off we go. We're waiting on the 2 shims to arrive still, so I'll pause it here and we'll wait for them to turn up. Turn up, turn up, turn up, turn up, mate. Okay guys, so we've now got all the Vanos unit back in, plugged in, we've got the valve cover gasket on. I've now just received the shims, which means I'm ready now to turn the engine over and make sure I've not catastrophically cocked anything up and got the timing wrong. So at the moment it's just off of top dead centre. If I move it back to top dead centre, which is around about there, doesn't have to be exact at this point, I'm going to do 2 revolutions of the entire crank sprocket, and I'm going to make sure that it comes back to where I want it to be. That is bang on top dead centre right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the pulley so I can see it without having to hold that camera in there. I don't wear red nail polish. This is actually a specific marking fluid, which I was given by a friend of mine down south. Lovely. Right, so now I'm going to turn it clockwise, a couple of rotations, make sure everything lines up, nothing interferes. And then what I'm looking for here is that both cams line up with the cutouts in cam cap number 1, which they do exactly, which is rather pleasing. And just to double check again, we'll get down in here, bang on, top dead center again. Wonderful, absolutely perfect. We're lined up, the Vanos unit is done. So there you go guys, that is an S50B30 Vanos rebuild, completed, made sure that everything's gone tickety-boo, back in the same spot. Obviously we've not run the car yet, we'll give you feedback when that's done, but that's pretty much all there is to it. It's a daunting process. I think I'm going to admit though, it's probably easier to do it in the S50B30 than it is to do it in an M52. The M52 has a lot of turning of cams you've got to do to get the cams to line up with the Vanos unit to be drawn back into the engine. That's not so much the case here. So if you want to give it a shot, if you want any questions or you want anything answered, bang it down in the comments as usual. Send me some feedback, and if you're going to have a go at this, don't be afraid. Get the Beisan kit, give it a shot. Not too bad actually. Let's get on with the rest of this job, get this engine back together and get out and take it for a drive, man. That's it for now. Paymo out, guys.